What's yours? I didn't believe in ghosts until, paranormal story. Years ago, my husband and I were trying to see if we could get a modest house by contract for deed. We took my sister along to look at the house. It still had someone's personal effects in it as though they had just stepped out, but was for sale. We walked all through and were hopeful. Suddenly, my sister said, "Wait, I know whose house this was. This house belonged to that guy my son knew who died in his kitchen." This was Tony's house. At that precise moment, a cabinet door shot open and whacked her on the backside. Never one to be rattled easily, she looked up and said, "Okay, Tony, I get it." We checked, it was indeed his house, the cabinet had been tightly shut, and the floor was stable. I've never seen a cabinet door randomly swing open with a force behind it like that. Not enough to hurt, but fast, as though a hand had whipped it open. You had to be there. I wish we could have gotten the house even if he was haunting it. He was known to be a nice guy, very funny, and we wouldn't have minded sharing it with him. When I was in college, I lived in an apartment complex. Every once in a while, at like 2 in the morning, I would hear breaking glass. It was clear as day when it happened, there was no doubt it was a window breaking. Never found any broken glass anywhere around the apartment. My younger brother would come out and party with us, and once or twice he came busting into my room, thinking someone was breaking in. Finally, one night, my girlfriend stayed over. She would kick and push in her sleep and at some point nudged me and I woke up. When I looked over at her, she wasn't asleep. She was sitting at the foot of the bed, facing away from me. When I said her name, she stood up and walked out of the room. Glass break. I looked around and realized that she was still laying next to me in bed. That was the only time I saw anything in that place but heard the sounds pretty consistently. My mom and dad passed just 5 weeks apart, of unrelated cancers. We had taken my son with us to my parents' house to feed their cats, which we would go on to adopt. My son was 7 at the time, he wandered downstairs to explore. At some point he reappeared upstairs, strangely subdued. Now at the time H hadn't yet learned to lie, nor did he make stuff up. My wife noticed his demeanor and asked, "What's up, kid?" Pop is outside by the fence. "I want to go home now." When I was in college I lived in these really old dorms. Hadn't been renovated in over 70 years and the thermostat looked like the first version of one. We each had our own keycard to the place, this is important for later. The doors automatically lock behind you the moment they shut. The bedroom is designed in that cabinets line close to the ceiling of each bedroom. There is also a mirror and a dresser space. Anyways, winter break came around and I decided to stay back while both of my roommates went home. It was just me and my dog for the next week or so. Both of my roommates went home to other states, so I knew there was no way they would be home at any point earlier than they said they would be. A couple of days into me being alone, I was taking a shower with the bathroom door open. I heard what sounded like a door slam in our dorm room. I peeked my head out the curtain and called out hello and called my roommates' names. No one answered. I kind of shrugged it off. A couple of nights later I was getting ready for bed, when again I heard a loud slam from one of my roommates' rooms. I froze and my dog started going ballistic and she hid under the bed. Mind you, my dog had never hid before and she weighed over 60 pounds. I called out again and even texted my roommate to ask if she had come home. She said she hadn't. Her bedroom door was locked so I couldn't get in there. I assumed it must have been housing maintenance doing something somewhere in the building. Now that I think back, at 9 p.m. at night honestly doesn't make sense, but I wasn't worried about it still. I kind of forgot about the situation until a week later. My roommate came into my room face pale. She asked if I had been in her room. I said there was no way and asked why. She told me to come look. My roommate had fairy lights strung up in her room she never turned off. They had been cut, both in the middle, and were hanging. And the 2 cabinet doors had fallen off. Which was the slam I must have heard that night. They lay on the floor, however the oddest part was they were stacked one on top of the other and not underneath the cabinet that was missing them but to the right of it. It was honestly the most bizarre thing I had ever seen. We asked housing if anyone had been in our apartment during that time frame and they said no. Ever since that point I had other weird experiences in that dorm from time to time. My dog got spooked every now and then after that incident during winter break. And I was happy to leave when the time came. I believe, to this day, that the vast majority of, not all, paranormal videos and photos have a plausible explanation outside of the paranormal. This means that these videos and photos can be easily explained away as either CG, poor quality cameras, pareidolia, or as outright fakes. Needless to say, I do believe that there still can be paranormal shit that happens. However, at the time when this happened about 8 years ago and when I didn't believe in ghosts as much, my family and I were staying at the Fort Garry Hotel in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I had a few spare moments and decided to explore the hotel because it is absolutely beautiful. I got lost as I usually do in buildings since I get directionally challenged the moment I step into one. Anyways, I happened to run into someone that looked like they worked for the hotel but weren't housecleaning or a clerk, so I was unsure of their position or job. I asked for directions back to the lobby since I had to meet my family in a few minutes. The moment I arrived in the lobby and walked past the front desk, a clerk and a security guard were staring at me in shock and pale faces. The security guard asked me who I was talking with earlier for the directions back to the lobby. I told him I thought it was someone who worked at the hotel. Well, wouldn't you know, it turns out that floor I was on, I can't remember it for the life of me, has a bunch of paranormal shit that goes on regularly. I don't know if he was supposed to, but the security guard showed me the footage he had just seen. The person I was talking with never appeared on the security feed even though they should have been in plain view. It was super creepy because I had shaken this person's hand for some reason and the footage just showed me shaking hands with the air. The person appeared in front of me as any other person would have. When I touched their hand it felt like any squishy person would normally, and yet they never showed up on the footage. There was no way I could have blocked out the person from view of the camera either as I'm only 5 feet 6 inches. The security guard even pulled up a second angle for further proof. No one else believes me despite the footage. To this day, I still don't know how to explain it. I work in a hotel that was built in 1885, so I have plenty of stories. But one that still gives me goosebumps would be the time I was vacuuming. It had randomly stopped while I was halfway through cleaning the room. I thought the plug had fallen out of the socket, so I went to plug it back in but it was in fine. So I checked the vacuum itself and it was switched off by there but it had been right behind me the whole time. I switched it back on thinking I had just bumped the switch with the hose, but after a few seconds it turned back off again. I went back and forth fighting with whatever spirit was there to keep it on but after about 3 or 4 times I gave up and left the room. And went on to the next one where it worked fine and continued to work well for the remainder of the cleans. Whoever was in there obviously thought it was funny to play jokes, as I never felt afraid while in there. And for anyone wondering, I did manage to make it back in there and finish cleaning before more guests arrived. When I was 3, my grandfather passed away. I don't really remember him, like at all. I know exactly what he looks though, as my grandma still has pictures of him all around her house, and I've seen the home videos of him and myself, and my younger sister when she came along, of him playing with us and him lighting my candle at my first birthday, that sort of thing. There is an exception though. For years I've had this random memory that must have occurred only a few months or so before his passing, because I'm pretty sure in this memory I was 3, or very close to it, and my sister was around a year old. I have this very vivid memory of myself sitting at a kitchen bench, and my sister in her high chair, and my granddad playing pop-up behind the kitchen bench. Like he would duck down behind the bench, and doing a big pop-up surprise making a different funny face each time. I was laughing, and my baby sister was doing the typical baby big laughing. It's nothing special in what happened or what went down, but yet it's so strong and vivid. Now, despite how vivid and strong that memory is, I was never sure if it actually happened. Like I said, I was only 3, I barely remember my granddad and apart from that memory the only things I really know about him are stories from my mom and grandma and from the home videos. I could totally be making it up, which is very possible given what we know about memories from young childhood fading or being twisted in the sense that we misremember or even have completely false memories. Flash forward to last year when I was pregnant with my first, and my friend group were talking about my family and what do they think baby will look like etc. I talked about my granddad, how I barely remember him but I have this one memory, it goes like this, but I'm not sure if it's really real etc. blah blah blah. That night after catching up with my friends, I had an incredibly vivid dream. In this dream, the memory was being reenacted. I was watching my granddad pop up and down behind the counter, making funny faces and making me and my sister laugh, as I remember. But after the 5th or 6th time of him doing it, he pops up, but becomes serious, and looks directly at me. He tells me that yes, this really did happen, he loved playing this game with us girls. He is happy I remember this, and don't worry, I'm not making a false memory, everything is all good. I'm not superstitious. While I'm open to the idea of ghosts and the supernatural, there is still a large part of me that is very skeptical. And a part of me does think that dream was just a figment of my subconscious's imagination. But I also do think my granddad came to me in that dream that night to reassure me and confirm that memory was real. Babysitting my niece when she was 2 years old. The place was a very old house my sister was renting, built in the 1930s. I'm alone in the place with her while my sister is working overnight. It's about 11 p.m. and she's been asleep for a couple hours at this point. I'm watching TV in the living room, and see her running down the dark hallway. Stops just before the entryway to the living room, and I jokingly said, "You better get back to bed, or I'm gonna get you." And got up to get her back in bed. I turned the hallway's light on, and her bedroom door is still closed. Weird, so I open it to find my niece completely passed out in her bed. Drooling and everything. It wasn't my niece I saw in the hallway, so I took her to sleep with me that night. We were taking a tour of the Battleship, Massachusetts in Falls River for my girlfriend's 30th birthday. She wanted to do scary stuff and I wanted to see museums, so we stayed at the Lizzie Borden house and the next night at the Shanley Hotel. I didn't personally feel any definitive paranormal activity at each location, but there were definitely signs. The one place I actually wanted to go that wasn't meant to have any paranormal activity was the ship. While we were touring the bathroom/cafeteria area, I was snooping around the shower, just curious, when I got tapped on the shoulder. Thinking it was my girlfriend, I turned around and no one was there. She was a few rooms away and we were the only two people in the area. Nothing was hanging above me or leaking. The area was a little cool and it just felt like as if a human touched my shoulder, and I am 100% certain it happened. I found it ironic considering the other places we had been were known for their ghost activity. A couple years ago, I was 23 at the time, I was still living with my parents. I was upstairs in my bedroom hanging out in my room and watching TV. I was on the phone with my friend at the time, and while I was on the phone I exited my room and went downstairs to have a cigarette. The only other person in my parents' house that day was my dad, who later I found out was asleep in his room on the main level. Anyway, I was gone for about 7 minutes and I walked back upstairs and entered my bedroom. I was still on the phone at the time, and I walked towards my bed and sat down. Eventually, after 20 seconds or so, I glanced back up to play my TV, and there at the end of my bed was a piece of paper sticking up from the base. I just remember not understanding what I was seeing, and never in my life have I so quickly dropped dead silent. I say dropped dead silent in a way to try and explain what it feels like when you're coming to terms with something your brain isn't ready or fully capable of understanding. I just remember going, "Nate." And he kept saying what, and I could hardly speak. I quickly said I'll call him back and immediately took out my phone and took a picture. I took a picture before doing anything else, before I even studied what the piece of paper was, before I did anything at all. I took a picture. I took a picture because I couldn't believe my eyes. I don't know how it got there, why it was placed the way it was, and why it looked the way it did. I'm getting goosebumps right now. Anyway, it was an old economics paper of mine talking about the government and the divide our two-party system creates in America. I wrote this econ paper 3 years prior in a college intro to econ course. There was originally 2 pages to it, but it was missing its second page. The edges of the page were burnt, and there was a big yellow triangle that almost looked like it was highlighted on, smack dab in the middle of the page. It almost looked luminescent, or like a dollar bill does. Anyhow, it absolutely scared the fuck out of me. That paper had to have been in my closet stacked away with all my other school work, and now it was ripped from the other page and was placed at the edge of my bed, sticking upright, for me to see. I was gone for only 7 minutes, nobody could have done that. It was absolutely impossible. Shortly after that bizarre situation occurred, I dodged the hell out of my parents' house, and went to a hotel with a friend of mine. The second part of the story is just as scary, but I don't even want to get into that right now. Anyway, I still wish I knew what it meant. I can't tell if it was good or bad. I don't know what the symbolism was, why the paper had weird burns around the edges, and WTF the large luminescent triangle meant. I still don't know why or how, but my concept and understanding of the world has changed ever since. I was only gone for 7 minutes. Growing up, my family moved around quite a bit, due to divorces and stuff, renting, moving to permanent homes, etc. In my childhood home, my brother and I would regularly play in the basement. However, one room made both of us unexplainably uneasy. We didn't like to walk by it at the end of the hallway, wouldn't use the bathroom by it, would never leave each other alone in the basement, etc. It was a negative, heavy feeling neither of us could describe at a young age. This room was our guest bedroom. We never had guests stay the night, so it was always unoccupied. There was a bedroom set with an old wooden frame bed and chest. It came from my dad's family and he always kept it around despite my mom's protests and wanting to change the room to something more useful. Years later, talking to my dad about the dislike for this room and the negative presence I felt around it, he told me his stories within this house. He used to use the bathroom across the hall from the room, and would leave the door cracked since no one was down there anyways, and he would always see something going past the door, like someone going past the door up and down the hallway. My brother as a baby would look over his shoulder while being held staring at something and sometimes giggling at an empty space in the room. My dad eventually yelled at it to get the fuck out, and after that my brother never laughed or stared at empty spaces, and my dad only felt the presence in the room and in the basement hall. So obviously at this point I conclude this entity has a connection to my dad. So later in my early teens my parents are divorced and my dad moves out taking this furniture with him. We end up not in a good place, disliking each other, arguing, a rift between us. This presence was always felt to me around this bedroom set, and once we move the negative heavy feeling is still in this guest bedroom with this furniture. As our arguing gets worse, I feel the presence all the time, catch glimpses of someone/something, in mirrors, in reflections of glass, in my dreams. I always felt watched and looked over. I start getting sleep paralysis, and this entity that looks like a young adult woman with long dark hair starts in the corner of my room, and eventually is weighing down on my chest and suffocating me. I wake up gasping for air multiple times and eventually a bruise on my chest. I catch it in the reflection of the TV the next day and feel like I can't breathe. I mentioned about this weird experience to my massage therapist that's very spiritual, and she shuddered when she touched my chest and described the entity exactly as I saw it in the reflections and my sleep paralysis. It's been years now and my dad and I have mended. The presence remains in the guest bedroom and always will until my dad gets rid of this attachment with this ghost, I think. He knows that he has a ghost attached to him but lives peacefully with it. A few years ago, back when I had a social life and the economy wasn't as fucked, I was looking to rent a small house or apartment to finally live on my own. One of the places I went to scout out was the lower floor of a house in the outskirts of the richest area in town, La Marsa. The person showing me around was a gentle, polite man in his early 50s, accompanied by his teenage daughter. The house was clean, with light flooding through the windows. While it was empty of furnitures, as was advertised, it's common here, it was clearly well maintained. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was unwanted there. I was on edge the entire visit. I felt almost tracked, for lack of a better word. And there was a pungent smell that I could at best call the smell of death. The kind of outdoorsy, dusty, moldy smell you'd encounter at a crypt or a badly maintained cemetery. I power through the entire visit, tell the owner I'd contact him ASAP with my final answer, and leave. A few days later, I was sitting with a group of friends at a cafe, trying to help one of us, let us call him Jay, find a home to rent after his current landlord asked him to leave in 4 months. As the subject of La Marsa came up, Jay said, "I've seen some places there, but all of them were way over budget. I'm still pissed though cause there was that place." "What place?" "A first floor of a house, at the very end of the district." Right as I entered, my fight or flight instincts triggered. "Was it the landlord's?" "No. It was a dude in his 20s, and I met and talked with the owner and his daughter on my way out. They were legit cool people." "So, the house?" "Yeah. There was that odd creepy smell of God knows what. As soon as I came in, my mind went people died here. There was death here." "Me, can you tell me where it was?" One Google Maps later, I confirmed that he went to the same place as me. Still weirds me out to this day. "Was babysitting my parents' friend's child. They were out for dinner and someone had to take care of the baby and I volunteered. I was about 11 to 12 at the time and wasn't that close to the baby. The house they lived in was very old, but had been refurbished to look nicer. It was around 7:30 when I put the baby to bed, then I was just chilling on the couch for an hour before I heard something. It sounded like floorboards creaking. It was around 8:30 now, but since this baby was no taller than a foot, it couldn't have been her. It was a single family house and the nearest neighbors were about 10 yards away. Nobody was home except me and the baby. I went upstairs to make sure the baby was okay, but she was sitting up in her crate just staring down a hallway through a separate door that was slightly creaked open. I went over to see what she was looking at. I opened the door all the way and a cold wind swept my ankles, no windows open and no ventilation in this hall, and what seemed like a figure's shadow creeped into the other room. I grabbed the baby, went straight downstairs, and locked her and I in a small reading room until around 12 p.m. when the parents came home. Never babysitting in a house from 1920 again. I was raised a skeptic, so I tend to lean toward things having a logical answer, but there's been a couple instances I still couldn't explain entirely until recently. The most recent was hearing my cabinet door slam closed in the kitchen while I was in the bedroom. But before I moved to where I'm at now, I lived with my ex-fiancé at the time, and he would often be at work while I was home due to opposite schedules. So one of the times I was relaxing in the bedroom at night, my dog and I both heard this woman's voice, clear as day as if it were right outside my bedroom door, "Go geez." So I panicked and listened for a bit and heard nothing else, went outside with the dog and saw nobody, then promptly told my ex what happened, and to lighten the situation a bit we named her Geez Louise. Turns out though when I'm sleep deprived I get visual and auditory hallucinations super easily. So, Pretty much any ghostly experience I've had since then I just chalk it up to that. I'm a truckie, mainly do all road train work from Brisbane up around the top of Australia to Perth and along the Nullarbor. Seen some strange shit but nothing like this, mate. Never really ventured into Vic and NSW due to scalies and revenue raising, but had to do an express run to Melbourne via Sydney and had to come back up the Newell Highway to collect a load for Toowoomba. My boss said I don't mind if you pull up before you get around Coonabarabran, as some drivers choose not to go through at night, with a giggle in his voice. I said, she'll be right, mate, plenty of hours left, all good, so I hooked in. Was in between Coonabarabran and Narrabri, and a Sheila, out of nowhere, flagged me down hitchhiking looking to go home to her camp, and I thought, WTF is this shit? I said hop in, and the hair stood up all over my body with an instant thought I should have kept going. She stunk like nothing I smelt before, and the cab was destroyed with stench. She didn't say a word and just gazed ahead. About 20 kms down the road and not passing one vehicle, the old woman said, "Here, this is it," and I had to stop in a gully, and off she went with a bag. No thanks, nothing. I looked around but not a fucking thing in sight, with no lights or tracks or anything. Glad she was gone because my guts was almost ready to explode. Pulled up the other side of Narrabri for a few hours and decided to get going at daybreak, but had to sleep in the trailer because the smell was horrible. Woke up to another truckie kicking his tires doing a pre-start, and I climbed out, to which he replied, "Fuck mate, they're working you pretty hard." I continued to explain the cab's absolutely stinking from the hitchhiker lady, and he went pale white and told me exactly where it happened. I said yes mate, and he said, "Mate, that nutter was ran over back in 1993 by a truck." I gulped and thought, fuck me, WTF is going on, is this fucker for real? This was in 2014 and to this day never been anywhere near that part of NSW. Pillage a princess is real for sure. I told the boss and he laughed and said, "There's coldies in the fridge, so hurry the fuck up." He showed me the camera in the truck shows the passenger door open by itself and close by itself as I'm looking across talking, but nothing on the video of her, just thin air. I decided to take a nighttime stroll sometime between 12 to 1 a.m. range and left my apartment. I walked along the road that led to the woods nearby and contemplated on whether to follow the road that led through the woods. I decided against it as I wasn't stupid and it was pitch black with zero lights and only able to see a few feet in front of you. So I decided to head back home. I barely walked 15 feet from the woods and I heard footsteps directly behind me. I turned and seen no one, and it continued every time I started walking back. Problem was there was no hiding spots for someone to hide if they were following me, and the footsteps sounded like they were only 2 to 3 feet at most away. I also used to watch those haunted house reenactments, so what I got from those was that ghosts react to fear, so if it was some spirit I shouldn't act scared. So instead I laughed when I heard the steps again. This time it seemed to stop. I got home and went to bed, and that same night I was woken abruptly about an hour later to a guy saying PSST. I looked around and no one was there, so I just said aloud, "Not right now. I am trying to sleep," and went back to bed. Thing is, if it was just the second thing I could explain it off, but they happened same night, so it feel like they were connected. It was one off as it never happened again, otherwise I would have went to get checked out, lol. I always thought it was a bit close-minded to assume there were no such things as ghosts or stuff of that nature. Just because I didn't have any personal experiences, didn't mean they didn't exist. Science discovers new things every day. And then I did have an unexplainable experience. I was 10 years old and my dad, mom, younger brother and I were visiting family in Virginia for Thanksgiving. It was a full house with cousins, aunts and uncles and grandparents taking up every available space, so my family had to sleep downstairs in the semi-finished basement. My brother and I got cots and my parents had the pull-out sofa bed. The basement had 2 double doors that led out into the backyard. My uncle stated that they always kept the outside light on, but he would turn it off for us so we could sleep. So it's the middle of the night and I'm laying on the cot sleeping when I heard a whisper that sounded like someone saying my name. I was awake, but I kept my eyes closed because I didn't know what it was. It didn't sound like any of my family. It sounded gruff and growly. Then I heard footsteps start from directly next to my cot and proceed to pace around the room. I opened my eyes into slits and could just make out my brother sound asleep next to me. Anger started to overtake fear as I thought maybe one of my cousins was pulling a prank or something, so I opened eyes wide. First thing I noticed was the light was on outside, which was weird. But then I saw an enormous shadow standing outside the 2 glass doors, staring in. This thing had to have been at least 8 feet tall. And as I'm staring at this thing, it very slowly materializes through the glass doors without sliding them open and is now within inches of my parents' heads. I couldn't see its face, but I instinctively knew it was staring directly at me. It raised its arms like it was going in attack mode, whether towards me or my parents, I couldn't tell. I opened my mouth to scream but nothing came out. So I just threw the covers over my head and recited the Lord's Prayer over and over. I had never been so scared in all my life. I literally thought I was going to die. That this thing, whatever it was going to jump on me and kill me. And then after all that, I somehow fell asleep. I have no idea how. I wake up the next morning and I immediately tell my dad what happened. He just kind of laughed and said, "I was laying right there, why didn't you wake me up?" That was a good question, and in retrospect I feel fucking stupid for not trying to wake up my dad. I guess I was just so scared, I could hardly move. Anyway, not saying what I saw was a ghost, but I saw something unexplainable and it frightened me to my core. This happened back around 2009. I have a little brother who was born in 2008. Growing up, I'd always have weird things happen to me. For example, I'd be in my room, and I'd hear knocking at my door, go to check, and no one was there. One time I heard knocking coming from the mirror, and I brushed it off because I was young and didn't know what paranormal was. When my brother was about 18 months, my grandparents flew to where we were. That's when things got weirder. One day, my grandma was sleeping. She had woken up screaming. When we rushed to the room she was in, she was hysterical. Praying, screaming, crying. We had asked what was wrong and all she could say was my brother's name. Over and over. So we all rushed to his room in fear that something had happened to him. He was okay. Sleeping peacefully. My grandfather comforted my grandmother and we had waited until she fell back asleep. My mom, dad and I went to the living room, sat down and just didn't know what to say. I kid you not, about 20 minutes later, we had heard a voice coming from my brother's baby monitor. It was like a whisper. We looked at each other in shock, and checked the camera. There was nothing. We checked on my brother, he was sleeping, then went back to the living room thinking we were crazy. 5 minutes later, we had settled down and had turned on the TV. My dad had just fallen asleep when we heard a voice, like in a deep growl from the baby monitor. It was loud, and very scary. My mother screamed, and in the exact moment she screamed, my brother's door slammed shut, my grandma started screaming, my dad ran to my brother's room and my brother began crying. My dad couldn't get the door open. Eventually, he broke the door down and everything went quiet. My brother was just looking at my dad, my grandma was whispering prayers and my mom was still crying. At the age I was, I didn't know what had just happened. We ended up going to my uncle's house, who at the time, and still is, a pastor. My brother and I were outside with my cousins playing. We were babysitting him. Being kids, we weren't the best of babysitters and shortly after, we couldn't find my brother. We had ran to our parents crying and they had become frantic. Us kids looked outside and the parents were inside searching. My uncle's house was a 2-story. There was the basement, which had been converted into a living room. The ground floor, and the second floor. My cousin had looked up to the second floor, and sure enough, saw my baby brother in the window of the bathroom. Climbing out onto the roof. I don't know if it's classed as a roof to be fair. It was kind of like one, but it was just some tiling that went out under the second floor windows, as a means of cover from rain if you were to walk out under them. We had yelled and I ran straight to the bathroom. My grandfather came with me and we both couldn't open the door. I stood back to let my grandfather try and then I heard a female voice on the other side. Very subtle, very easy to miss. I just caught it. So I had bent down, peeked under the door and I saw what seemed to be a black figure, at the window. My grandfather had just managed to open the door, and when he did, there was no one. He had reached out, grabbed my brother and ran downstairs. Eventually, all of us kids had to go inside. We went to the living room with all the adults, and sat down. My uncle, the pastor, had begun to pray. We had a family prayer, and my uncle had noticed my baby brother's behavior. After our family prayer, my uncle began to pray over my brother. I watched my baby brother squirm. I never understood it. He was wailing, crying, squirming as if my uncle's words were physically cutting through him. Eventually, after what had seemed like years, my baby brother stopped moving. Everyone just stared at him. Then we heard him cry. Just a normal cry. My mom started crying and my dad had began thanking my uncle. It has never been spoken about again, but it has always lived with me. My brother is now turning 14 and has no recollection of this whatsoever. To this day, I wonder what it was, or whom it was exactly, that wanted my brother and what had driven it to choose him. I've never believed in spirits/ghosts even though I live by a graveyard. One day I was helping my dad do yard work with my sister at my dead grandma's house, who passed away about 5 years ago in 2016. We got bored so we asked our dad if we could go play in the path by the railroad tracks right beside the graveyard. Our dad said yes, and when we were halfway down the path we needed clippers and my sister left them. She turned back and went to go grab them. I kept going when she was gone, and while I was walking I saw something running toward me, and it wasn't an animal, it looked like it had a white shirt. I hesitated for a second and ran as fast as I possibly could, screaming for my life. I looked back while I was running and saw nothing. I told my sister and my dad, but they didn't believe me. When we went back down the path I smelled something dead. We found nothing, but it still to this day smells like a dead human, and it still scares me to this day. I grew up in the backwoods of Missouri, our nearest neighbor about a half-mile away. His wife tragically passed away and he ended up moving, and his house, a collection of several prefab trailer homes connected by some elaborate porches, and stayed empty for a few years while he tried to sell it. He paid my family to mow the yard every week and generally keep an eye on the place to protect it from copper thieves and break-ins, and being a teenager I got put on mowing duty. The place was creepy, and being around it alone in the muggy summers I always expected to see someone staring at me from the empty windows. Eventually I got up the nerve to go poke around and see if I could look inside. Nothing nefarious, just curious. All the doors were locked except one to a kind of shed at the back that just seemed to be jammed. I was able to get it open and saw that it had been blocked with a rock from inside. As the door swung open I saw, hanging from a rafter in the center, what I immediately thought was a corpse. Turns out it was an old dress military uniform, jacket, pants, etc., hanging from a clothes hanger on a rope in the dead center of the room. The air was dead still, hot and humid, but I got chills as I pushed the door open more and saw the uniform slowly and deliberately turn in my direction, pause for a moment, and then turn its back on me again. I closed the door and bolted back to my riding lawn mower and didn't go back there for a few weeks. When I did get the nerve to try the door again, it seemed like the rock was back in place. I didn't bother it again and the house sold the next year. Okay, so this didn't happen to me, but to a close friend. She was living with 2 other people in a flat with 2 rooms. The bigger room was shared by 2 people and the smaller one was taken up by another. Weirdly, anyone who used to sleep in the small room had difficulty sleeping. They all tried sleeping in that room one by one, but no matter which person slept there, they always end up with a restless night. They didn't think much of it until one day they had friends over for a sleepover and were hanging out in the bigger room. The girl who was sitting near the door of that small room heard someone whisper, "Why are you all leaving me alone tonight?" She freaked out and told everyone about it, but they all thought that it's probably because they all were so high and she is imagining stuff. But after that incident they became super conscious of their surroundings and started noticing stuff like weird sounds or a feeling that someone is behind you when you are all alone. But this isn't even the worst that happened to them. So they decided to leave that place. On the day they were moving their stuff out, the girl went to the small room, and as she was about to grab her bag from under the bed, it got stuck and she heard someone saying this in a crying voice, "Please don't leave me, everyone who has stayed here has left. I really like you, don't leave me." And it doesn't end here. She was obviously freaking and called her friends crying, and basically she had a panic attack. But somehow her friends convinced her to go back with them to that place to get the remaining stuff. Everything went comparatively well that day till the point they were about to step out of the door and that same bag got stuck again. There was nothing on the floor, and it got stuck. No matter how much they tried to move it, it didn't. That's when everyone was majorly freaked out. They ran out of there leaving all their stuff there and left without looking back or even locking the door. Note, if you've read it till the end, thank you. I'm not good at storytelling and English isn't my first language, so thank you for being patient. I was babysitting a friend's baby 3 years ago and it was around 3 months old. They went on a date night while I stayed and made sure the baby didn't die, I guess. Around 2 a.m. I checked the baby monitor and to my horror I saw a hand in the crib. I knew I was home alone and it was a small house anyway. I grabbed a baseball bat from the shed and ran in there and turned the light on. Nothing there, but I made the baby cry. I know I saw something. I wasn't even tired or high or anything. I couldn't sleep knowing that I saw something there. I took the baby and put it in the same bed as me and slept. He started getting very fussy whenever I tried putting him back in the crib. At 4 a.m. I couldn't sleep and looked at the baby monitor and saw 2 hands now on the crib. And I'm not taking the piss right now, but I swear one of the hands had their finger up. I told the parents and they thought I was just tired. I moved into an old farmhouse, probably built in the 40s. The door up to the attic was off of the main bedroom and had a bunch of locks on it. In the attic was an incredibly dusty bed, and there were snake skins draped everywhere. I'm not kidding, like 100 plus snake skins. The main bedroom was under the attic room, and after moving in, I would wake up at night because I could hear a marble being rolled back and forth, over and over. There were a lot of locks on the outside door to the main bedroom and on the door to the outside, where you had to have a key to unlock it. I had a traveling job at that time, and every time I left, the light bulbs blew out. I had to replace the bulbs each time I came back. Could have been faulty electric, but electrician said everything was fine. My theory is that someone was locked up in that room for being insane or criminally insane, and never let out and died up there. Technically not ghost, but it's still super weird. For background, my mother passed around 6 years ago now. I had been told she passed from falling down the stairs. They were somewhat steep, and she had an accident years back which resulted in her head being slit open, so her head was quite dodgy. But I only recently found out it was due to suicide/odd. She had postnatal depression and my little brother was born in the year she passed, so I put 2 and 2 together. But recently I had this dream where I was chasing after her in some woods. My friends were telling me not to chase her, and eventually when I got to her she turned around and spoke, "There's something you don't know," or along the lines of that, and obviously I searched it up and it said something like that. Now I didn't know she had OD'd before this, I just had a feeling it was weird how she died. But 2 days later I asked my dad about it and he told me the whole story the next morning. It's just strange that my dream told me about it. Does anyone else think so? Well, I had always had weird experiences and wasn't totally in disbelief, but one thing that happened that scared the shit out of me was, I was in my room writing in my journal before bed. It was a bit later and my parents were asleep. Most lights in the house off except a little desk lamp. All of a sudden this figure stood in front of me and I couldn't breathe. It only lasted maybe 5 seconds, but as soon as I could move I ran to the bathroom and locked the door. When I did, I heard footsteps immediately leave my room and the door gently closed behind. I stayed in that fucking bathroom for an hour at least. Still scares me to this day. The house I live in with my boyfriend is from the 1800s and was built by slaves. I think one is still here. Weird shit happens here. Especially in our closet, the double doors open and shut on their own. I finally realized my cat was acting strange when this would occur. Once she was staring intently into a corner of our bedroom and slowly began tracking something. I grabbed my phone and hit video. Right after I started to film, the door slammed so hard it rebounded before slamming shut. I got it on tape, and even though Will is a strictly science guy, PhDs in archaeology and anthropology, as well as a law degree, has finally been convinced. Day before yesterday I was leaning back onto the couch while he was wiping his hands with a napkin, and the balled up napkin suddenly flew out of his hands and bounced off my nose. Didn't hurt, just startled me, and landed like 4 feet in front of the coffee table. Funny, yes, but also a bit spooky. Not my story, but my father's, because I've always believed in ghosts. About 6 or 7 years ago my father, who owns a construction company on the side, was working on an older woman's house. She lived alone, as her husband died a few years before and all of her children were adults with their own homes. She would often leave to run errands while my dad worked alone in the house, painting, tiling, and doing minor fixes. He said he always felt uncomfortable and like he was being watched whenever he was alone. He couldn't figure out why, because he has never been particularly paranoid and has never believed in the paranormal. He eventually learned to ignore it, sometimes leave the room for a bit, or close the door he felt like he was being watched from. One of the last days he was there, he was painting the foyer. The foyer had a giant chandelier he had to remove to paint the ceiling. The woman told him to be very careful with it, because it was her husband's favorite feature of the house and reminded her of him. My father went through the task of removing it and carefully organizing the crystals so that nothing would be damaged or lost. He finished the job and began hanging it up, but several pieces were missing. He says he looked everywhere. It was getting late, so he decided to start packing up his tools. His plan was to come back in the morning to finish cleaning up whatever construction mess was left and look for the pieces. Finally, he finished packing up and went to grab a coat he had taken off while in the middle of painting, after taking the chandelier down. There, wrapped in his coat, were all the missing pieces. He says he freaked out, quickly put his ladder back up and placed them on the chandelier. Grabbed his things and got out as fast as he could. He waited in his car for her to come home, told her that he would be back in the morning to finish cleaning, and left. After that he refused to go back in alone and later found out the husband had died in the house. He 100% believes the husband was playing a prank on him and says there is absolutely no way those pieces could have been wrapped in his coat. He believes in ghosts now and has even started to believe that the house he bought a few years ago is haunted. I also believe him when he says there is no way they could have been in his coat because my father is a very diligent, organized, and tidy person. Nothing is ever out of place with him and he cannot figure out how those pieces would have ended up with his coat. My SO's grandfather was ill and dying of cancer. The night he died I had a dream that I was sitting at the edge of his bed at his home. I'd never seen his room. I can still picture the bed, the soft yellow light of a table lamp and a pad and pencil sitting next to it. I say to him, "Your hours are up. Shall I write them?" And he replied, "Yes. Write them." Then I shot up in bed like someone had just shouted in my ear to get up. My SO's phone is vibrating on the other side of our long room, garage converted to bedroom. I go pick it up and it's mom calling to say grandpa had just died. I'll preface this story by saying I don't believe in ghosts, and still don't even following this experience, but it was quite a good one nonetheless. I was working a night shift in an old, residential building and lots of the other night staff had eerie ghost stories. My colleague and I were drinking coffee in the office area and she was sharing them all with me. I was trying to explain to her while, despite these making for entertaining spooky stories, there are rational explanations and ghosts are illogical and non-existent. She was having none of it, and upping the ante on her stories in terms of numbers of witnesses, the good character of those who saw it, etc. etc. She then also confessed her anxiety that my skepticism would anger the ghosts and make them manifest. I laughed and said I hoped they'd bring it on. She was telling me off, and looking genuinely afraid, so I dropped it. Later that night, we did our walk rounds together and out of nowhere, the TV in a side room flipped on right as we walked past. The TV was at full volume, blaring static on no channel. My colleague flipped out and started screaming, convinced this was proof of the ghosts and I'd angered them. I turned the TV off using the remote that was lying there on the table. No one else was around, and I couldn't come up with an explanation for why it suddenly came on just as we came by. She had her proof, which I couldn't debunk, and despite my skepticism I got a bit of a jump scare, which probably was karmic in light of my attitude to her beliefs. But yeah, still don't believe in ghosts, but that moment got me close. I'm pretty sure there was something weird going on at my old house which I had lived in since age 3 until about 2016. For the most part the house tended to feel normal, but the basement always gave me this feeling of dread and I hated spending time down there, but I always just chalked it up to being a kid and the basement being a dark cold expanse that made me uncomfortable. But my mom has said at least on one occasion while she was down there she once saw a belt that was hung up suddenly swing like somebody hit it, but there was nobody down there. On another occasion while we were just returning from a day of shopping we pulled into the driveway and the one room visible from the street suddenly light up and darkened again as if somebody flipped the light switch and shut it off immediately after. My parents both saw it and my dad went inside to make sure there wasn't an invader or something, but he never found anything and we never could explain what caused the light to flick on. A few months before we moved out, me and my brother were goofing around knocking on walls and stuff for jokes, and at one point my brother set up a knock-knock joke by knocking on the wall behind him and the wall knocked back, as if somebody on the other side knocked in response, but the creepiest thing is that the wall he knocked on was on the second floor over a giant gap between our house and the neighbors, so there's no way anybody could have done that because they'd have to have been floating 20 feet in the air. To this day I am still mostly skeptical about ghosts and paranormal stuff, but I really can't explain those 3 events. Since then we have moved out and I haven't ever experienced anything like that again. I'm not sure what it was, maybe just coincidence or something, but I also do have a feeling that we don't know nearly enough about the natural world and maybe all of these strange occurrences are being caused by something we don't quite know about yet. I was roughly 4 or 5 sleeping with my parents in their room and in the same bed. My mom normally washes clothes and hangs them near the closest area on the hangers to dry. In the middle of the night I'm still awake. I see in the same area a ghostly figure of my mom in very light blue just hanging clothes. As I type this I'm getting goosebumps and shivers. I recently told my mom this when I was 25 a few years ago for the first time. I'll never forget that experience. A few other shit happened to me in the basement of another house. I had something yank at my foot twice on 2 different occasions. Just a very strong tug. The last and final thing that happened to me, I felt something trying to choke me and I couldn't breathe. I had a loss of breath in the middle of the night and had to scream for my parents. I was a grown-ass man, probably 18 at that time. Haven't had or seen anything strange since though. My mom said when I told her that I had the cord around my neck when she was giving birth. I guess there's a myth that for kids that this happens to they experience supernatural shit more. I'm not big on ghosts or supernatural shit, but I've shared these stories with my wife and a few friends. Still don't believe in ghosts, just like this story because of what it turned out to be. I'm sitting in my room watching some videos, when I see my door open on its own. When I look over, expecting my mom, something looks into the room, then darts back behind the door and runs off. I could hear its footsteps. Some backstory before this, we have a wooden floor outside my door. Anyways, I get up because I'm like, nah, someone broke into my house and I'm about to murder this bitch. I quietly open the door and start walking after them, when I'm intercepted by my dog, a rather large animal, with a bone in his mouth wagging his tail. At this point I know someone hasn't broken into my house, because my dog would have gone nuts. The reason I didn't think of him until now was because he's usually asleep in my parents' room at this time, so he wouldn't have noticed an intruder. So I go back to bed, assuming I was seeing shit. An hour later, My door opens and the thing looks into my room before darting out again. This time I got a better look at it and saw a shiny nose peeking and connected to what looked like a long face. I shoot out of bed and follow the footsteps. They stop right around the corner of the hallway. I creep over, look around it. There's my dog sitting there with the bone in his mouth, wagging his tail. At this point, I had my suspicions, so I go into my bathroom and shut the door, but stay standing by it. About 10 minutes later, I heard my door open and close. I get out of the bathroom, open my door. My dog had learned how to open my door and wanted me to leave so he could lay down on my bed and bury his bone in my sheets. I, 20F, have been living in my family house since I was around 2 years old. The house has always been haunted, and as a child it was easy to believe in ghosts because I was young and my brother always spun tales about the dark and what lives in it. When I was around 10 or so I didn't believe in ghosts, as I had never seen any and I was no longer afraid of the dark. Shortly after I had laughed at my brother for saying the house was haunted, I was laying in bed and had seen my mother walk down the hallway. Now this would be totally normal if my mom wasn't in Hawaii visiting my sister who had just given birth to my nephew. Years later, seeing spirits on the form of my family members is completely normal to the four of us living in the house, and it's kind of an everyday normal occurrence. Another thing that happened was shortly after me seeing my mom in the hallway. She had just came back from her trip and was helping me set up my PS2, and I was telling her the house was haunted. I had also had an Xbox and the game DJ Hero, which came with a turntable. As I sat there and told her about the ghosts, the turntable started spinning. Very slowly at first, and then so fast it flung the games that were sitting on it off of the whole desk it was sitting on. My mom just reached up and stopped the spinning and went on with her day. My grandpa had passed in December of 2016, and in November of 2018 my father gave me the chain that my grandfather had worn every day for the past 20 years. My grandfather was a jeweler in his spare time and had made the necklace with his signature double clasp block to keep it from ever falling apart. One night I was in the shower, playing music on my speaker, enjoying my shower, and every time a song had any type of profanity or mentioned any illegal substances or in gang-related actions, the song would change. Now this is years after having gotten used to my ghosts, so I asked them to please stop changing my songs. A few songs go by without change and I finish my shower and I'm drying off and my song changed again. I spoke to the ghosts saying leave my damn music alone, and my necklace, with the double clasp block that's hard for even me to take off, fell right off my neck and my music completely turned off. Never yelled at them about my music again. Finally, I was laying in bed one day facing away from my bedroom door and I had my eyes closed. You guys know that song from Annie that they sing in the beginning? The sun will come out, tomorrow. Bet your bottom dollar that, tomorrow will you, or however the lyrics go? The song started blasting from my hallway. I was home alone and didn't have a TV in my room or anything of the sort that could start playing music. As soon as I opened my eyes the song paused. I closed my eyes again and the song picked up right where it had left off. On and off it happened for about 5 minutes. Every time I opened my eyes it would pause, and when I closed then it played again repeatedly. Not very paranormal, but I live a few minutes away from an office building that used to be an insane asylum. My mom and I used to volunteer at the animal shelter, which was also very close by to both our house and said building, so naturally they would sometimes hold volunteer meetings inside. The first thing I noticed was how much the building still smelled like a hospital. It looked like one too, despite having been repurposed many years ago. I don't usually care too much for ghosts, but when I say I could not breath the entire time we were inside that building, I mean it. I was hyperventilating, couldn't stop fidgeting, and my heart was beating incredibly fast, sort of like an adrenaline rush, like my body sensed a danger I couldn't see. I still feel hints of those sensations whenever we drive past that building, and I can't explain why I felt that way back then, but needless to say I have never and will never set foot in that place again. I have had multiple experiences to the point where I cannot be convinced by any explanation that ghosts/spirits are not real. In one of my experiences we went with the route of using a Ouija board. My friend's house growing up wasn't haunted in the way you would think. There were two spirits that were equally friendly that each lived in his house at some point in the past. One was an old gentleman and one was a young child. One night some friends and I were doing a Ouija board in his house and was asking questions to the present spirits. First we asked for a sign to show us he was with us. The board spelled out plumbing. Sure enough, a moment later the toilet in the bathroom flushed, with no one in the bathroom. We were skeptical, so we decided to ask for another sign. The board then spells out electricity. Moments later the light in the bathroom flicks on, again, no one is in the bathroom. My friend hops up to turn off the light in the bathroom, and right when he flicks it off, every light in the house went off, except for the one in the bathroom which remained on. We were not so skeptical after this but were intrigued, so we asked for one more sign. This time we asked if it could perform a sign through our friend who was fast asleep snoring on the couch across the room. Moments later, said friend gets up off the couch, eyes rolled back, and sprints across the room at one of us on the board. He runs into him, falls directly back onto the ground, fast asleep, snoring as if he had never woken up. He remained this way all night. This is one of my experiences. I have others as well. I do fully believe in ghosts/spirits being with us. My mom bought a house on a lake outside of town. The previous owners had just got up and left. It was a nice 2-story house, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and we went to go clean it before we moved in. I was going to share a room with my little brother who was 8 years old at the time, me being 14, and we went up to our room to check it out for the first time. It was really spacious but felt off. I turned on the lights and started looking all around the room when I noticed blood splatter on the walls. It wasn't noticeable unless you were really taking a look. It looked as if someone tried cleaning it up but missed some and didn't care to clean it all. I then took a look at the back of our bedroom door and there was a burnt upside cross with a circle around it on the door. I showed my mom and we started cleaning and painting to cover up the blood and the cross. I didn't think much of it once we started moving in. That night my little brother went to sleep next to me and my mom said goodnight and walked down the long hallway, down the stairs and into her bedroom below us. I heard her door shut downstairs and everything. I was playing on my phone when the light in the hallway started flickering. You could hear the light switch being flipped on and off at the end of the hallway. I was also at an angle in my room where I couldn't see directly down the hallway and I thought it was my mom playing jokes on us, but I heard her down in her room. I yelled out, "Mom, stop, you're not scaring me," but the flickering continued and then I started to hear footsteps coming down the long hallway to my room while the flickering continued. I didn't say anything because I actually started to get scared. As the footsteps got closer and the flickering got faster, I started to hide my head under covers when my little brother yelled out, "Stop it," in the middle of his sleeping, and the flickering and footsteps seemed to stop just a couple feet from the entrance of my room. It did stop, but I felt a really cold rush of wind cover my room and hover over the top of my blanket. Come to find out, the neighbors had said the previous owners had meetings in the house and would invite people over. They'd all wear black and have candles to enter the house. Sounds like some sort of worshipping to me, and we lived there for a year or two before we left because not only did we find out our house was haunted, we found out our neighbor was a serial killer doctor who overprescribed people who he owed money to and was wanted by the police. Very weird story, beautiful house. Thank goodness we left when we did, and ghosts are real. My mom and a couple of her coworkers had just started up a charter school. They all met while working in the office of a private school, so I grew up with her friends' kids, M and J, and we all went to that same private school for free. This private school used to have 2 campuses, one in a central location and one up north. Eventually the northern one shut down because there weren't enough students, so a lot of the northern students ended up moving to our campus. My mom decided to help the private school out by renting the north campus as the new charter school's campus. One day my mom asked me if my siblings and I could help fix up the gym for the parent orientation that night. She told me all my friends would be there, so I agreed. After setting up chairs and sweeping floors, my friends and I decided to explore what was behind the stage. I had heard from students who moved from the northern campus that the place was seriously haunted, but I was 14 and in love with science. Horror movies amused me and I believed everything had a logical explanation. As we moved through the backstage we heard water dripping, but there was no signs of anything leaking.
J, and I didn't think much of it. We were more concerned that important wires could get fried if they got wet.
So we went looking for the steady sound of the water hitting the floor. It took a lot of weaving through boxes of backstage crap, dead microphones, and broken spotlights, but we eventually found a bathroom almost completely walled off by moving crates. Inside the bathroom was a giant wooden table and the words "Do this in remembrance of me" were carved into the side of it, upside down. That was our cue to exit and head back onto the stage, the part hidden behind huge curtains where the spotlights couldn't reach us. Here's the kicker, though. The thing that had me believing there are things in nature we aren't always meant to see. Against one of the walls was a ladder welded directly into the wall. It led to a small opening, which I assumed was used for storage. My friends and I, despite being a little creeped out, wanted to explore it. M went to look for my sister to tell her our plans, so Jay and I decided we would hide behind the curtain's folds and scare the crap out of them. We saw my sister walk backstage first. We called her over and let her in on our plans to scare M. It was so dark backstage that I could only make out her silhouette as she tilted her head in confusion. She calmly walked past us as we continued to ask her what she was doing. We stopped asking when she began to make her way up the ladder. We thought it was rude of her to execute the plan without us, especially because she had the flashlight. After a few seconds of waiting and M didn't show up, we decided to look out, and there she was. My sister and M were standing in front of the stage, talking to my mom. I was in my grandparents' room. My grandparents live with us. At the night, since you can either choose to sleep in your room or the spare bed in my grandparents' room. This night I chose the spare bed for some reason. I went asleep when I woke up unexpectedly at around 2:30 a.m. I couldn't go back to sleep, so I just went on my phone for a bit. After a while though, I heard a strange laughing voice as if it was like a demon. I heard it beneath the spare bed, so I woke my grandma up and told her what happened, but here is the creepy part. She also heard it and saw a glimpse of a green light. I didn't sleep that night and just waited for morning, freaked out. I still don't really believe in ghosts, but this is the only paranormal occurrence that I've had in my entire life, so I might as well share it. Throwback to when I was 9 or 10 years old. It was summer in a small Finnish town. Me and my sister were at our grandparents'. They had gone to sleep before us and we went to our bedroom. It was probably around 10:30 p.m. We didn't go to sleep immediately, we wanted to stay up for some time. Maybe 15 to 30 minutes after we went to our bedroom, we hear a knock on the door, not the door to enter the house, the bedroom door. I go to open it thinking it's one of the grandparents about to ask us to be quieter or something else. Nobody is on the other side of the door. Me and my sister get creeped out but for some reason laugh at it as well. Both of us look around the house, and sure enough, nobody else than us and the grandparents inside. Afterwards we did a confirmation with each other that we both really heard it, from the same place and at the same time. I don't think it was our minds playing tricks on us at the same time, because that would be a crazy coincidence. Also, neither of us had watched any scary/paranormal videos lately, which would be the reason our minds would play tricks on us. Nothing strange like this occurrence has happened to neither of us ever since. When I was around 8 or 9 years old, I was sitting on my bed in the evening playing on my Nintendo 3DS. At this time, my bed was still placed at the door of my room, so I was able to look a little into my brother's room. He wasn't home at that point because he was gone to a sleepover. Anyway, it was very quiet upstairs and the only family member home besides me was my mom, who's been in the living room the entire evening. Mind you, I have never witnessed a paranormal activity or anything similar. At some point, when I was still playing on my 3DS, I saw a black figure walking into my brother's room. It looked identical to my mom, so I was first scared and confused about that. I thought my mom probably had a reason for going into his room, but she didn't turn on the lights. Neither did I hear her coming up the stairs. There was just a black figure slowly walking into my brother's room. Of course, at that age, I was too scared to go look what went inside, but I eventually had the nuts to go inside and turn on the light. No one was there. It was fully empty. My friend rented a house in my hometown for he and his little boy. The kid was like 4 and had a big imagination. The previous owner was an old man who had passed a few years before. His daughter rented the house to them. She came over after a few months and was seeing the renovations he had done to the place. Not related, but part of his rent was in the form of repairs and renovations he did. The little boy was always playing make-believe with an imaginary friend. He was playing on the floor in the living room while the owner and my friend were chatting. She said to the little boy, "I see you like that toy I don't remember." He said, "Yes, Papa Tim, and I like to play with it." Tim was her dad's name. I moved into a new house 2 years ago, and while we were moving we would light candles. There would be no draft and the candle would randomly go out even if it had just been lit. No one blew it out. I got a cat last year and he's always really low to the ground creeping about, and I always catch him jumping really high as if something has scared him. When there is nothing there, he's always jumping over door frames and is terrified of a few rooms around the house, always staring at random areas as well. Staring is normal in cats, but it's really odd places he'll stay at. Me and an old best friend, we'll call her Cindy, had this app on our phones that picked up certain words. It's actually a really cool app, and we didn't believe it was actually something that could pick up ghosts and the things they were saying. So we had this app and it will start beeping if there's an entity around you. The bar will go from green to red. You also have a word bank and the camera is on so it can pick up the things around you. We're sitting here watching Family Guy when Cindy's phone starts beeping. It won't beep if there's a person or animal in front of it, or anything visibly moving. She looks at her phone and the bar is all the way on red. Ours were in different places. We were sitting about 5 inches apart. Her phone was on the left of her and mine was on the right of me. The beeping intensifies. We sit there in silence and turn off the TV. Therese, not a single other sound in her house. The beeping stops and she suddenly gets the sentence, "Get out." She looked at me with wide eyes and I just replied with, "Don't worry. We'll be fine." I was very skeptical. I did have this small gut feeling that something was wrong, but I had pushed it off. Then my phone started beeping like crazy and I got the sentence, "Why are you here?" Now, I was always at Cindy's house. We were inseparable, so you can imagine it was kind of unsettling. The beeping continued after the sentence, then suddenly stopped. We somehow decided to just put our phones in between us side by side. We sat there in silence for so long. I couldn't tell you how long, but it was a while. Then, you probably guessed it, the meter went up and started beeping, but this time a caution sign popped up on our screens. That's when things started going south. Our phones picked up the sentence, "Get out," at the same time. The beeping didn't stop. We sat there and waited. We received another sentence reading, "You need to leave this place," and that's when we started freaking out. I reached for my phone when the word "don't" came out of my speaker. I reeled my hand back. In all stupidity of me, I said, "Why would I listen to you? It's my phone and this is Cindy's house." I was freaking out. Then the beeping stopped. The meters were back at green. For a couple minutes everything was normal and we thought we were fine. Then the lights went out and her dog started barking like crazy. When I say that this isn't the only encounter we've had since then, I mean it. We stopped saying stupid shit like I said, but it was still bad. We looked up things about the town and we were given names while using this app. We looked into it and found multiple names. Our town was taken out by a tornado and a lot of people died or got severely injured and later died. We found some of those people in our app. I'll be honest, I've had this weird experience since we moved into our old apartment. I was like 9 or 10 when we first got there, and despite the house being brand new, every once in a while there would be this loud noise. Like, the type of noise a couch makes when you push it across the floor. We heard that noise all the time for the duration that we lived there. And we thought it was the dog upstairs. It didn't make sense, but it was the only reasonable explanation. However, when we moved into our new house, the sound came with us. And now there is zero explanation because no one is above us. We have an attic but there's nothing in it, my dad's checked. I still hear it occasionally but we don't talk about it much because aside from that noise nothing has ever happened. It's become normal. I don't believe it's ghosts because I've very rarely ever seen a ghost story that didn't have a reasonable explanation, but it was weird. I have many I can think of. My mom calls me in tune. However, the one that I still think is the most compelling did not come from me but my sister. We were heading to a movie one day with friends of ours. My sister and her friend were around 6, and my friend and I were 8 and 9. Our friend's mom was driving my sister and her friend while my mom was driving my friend and I. Tragically, 4 high school students had collided with another car along the route we were driving and I believe all but one were killed. The car was tarped over to hide the bodies, and the moms were doing their best to distract from all of the emergency response lights. Amidst all of this, my sister's friend casually said, "There is a girl standing next to that car, Mom." Except, there wasn't anyone near the car at that point. All of the first responders had pulled back to await for the removal of the bodies. Of those killed, one of them was a teenage girl and it is likely that she saw her in her transition out of this world, processing the end of her life. I've had my own experiences since then. I was just too young at the time to be a believer. I worked in a warehouse with 3 floors. I heard news that this place used to belong to some bad people and that people died in this property, drugs, prostitution, etc. One day I was in the basement and I was alone. I saw some sleeve of plastic cups all over the floor. Someone had knocked them and one bag was open, so you can imagine 50 cups on the floor all over the place. I got so angry because it wasn't the first time it happened. I figured someone dropped them and didn't bother to pick them up. So obviously I started cursing and started kicking the cups. I kicked one cup in front of me and it started rotating in a 360-degree angle. So after about 10 to 15 seconds of the cup spinning, it stopped. I was about to pick it up when it suddenly started spinning again right in front of me. I was startled to say the least. There was no air draft that could do that. And it was just that cup. How can the cup start spinning in its own? After a while it just started getting cold. This happened during a hot summer. The place didn't feel right. Started feeling like I was about to faint. Like my energy was been drained. I just ran. As soon as I made it outside I was back to normal. I know for a fact that place is haunted. I had stuff thrown at me. I used to work night shifts and would hear people whistle like when they want your attention. I would get a weird smell of smoke, like when people smoke a lot and it sticks to your clothes, but there was never there. I'm the only one in the whole building. Sometimes you'll hear footsteps on the top floor above you only to remember you're the only one in the building. The latest thing that happened was that one day I was walking down the stairs when I suddenly heard running footsteps behind me. Obviously I stepped to the side so that whoever was running down the stairs could pass since we work on a fast-paced place. When I turned back to see who it was, there was no one, just me on the stairs. Felt my whole skin crawl up. Not really a ghost story, I don't believe, but the story gave me chills nonetheless. Happened to my mom. She told me in the morning a month or so ago that she had quite an experience during the night. She woke up and couldn't fall back asleep. She often has sleep issues. She heard our dog being nervous downstairs, so after a while of listening to this she decided to go check if everything is okay. She got up and went to the bathroom across the hallway. The door was slightly open and she saw a silhouette. A dark, black silhouette. There was no way it was her shadow, there was no light source behind her. She turned the light on and there was nothing there. However, the thrash bag on the trash bin was slightly moving. Like there has just been some movement, and my mother has just entered the bathroom, so I don't think she caused it. I was listening to this like what the hell. After reading countless stories people post across this sub, I asked her for more details about the appearance of the silhouette. She said her first thought was Zorro, as in, a man dressed in black, wearing a hat and a cape. Now, my first thought was, a hat man? But she wasn't having a sleep paralysis. She's never had it. Maybe just a hallucination, but a weird experience anyway. My mum was weirded out. She doesn't believe in that stuff at all, but she was still interested. She jokingly asked me if I was summoning ghosts or something. Hell nah. What I also find interesting about this story is that 2 days prior I was trying to open my root chakra for the first time. Doubt it was connected in any way though. Once upon a time, I went to Thailand with a group of PPL. One of the hotel I stayed has some pretty strange thing going on. Like other hotel room it has a balcony, but strangely part of the balcony was black in color. As I was a kid at the time I do not really care what happened. Later on that night I heard someone is banging on the door. I looked through the security eye and there was no one. I thought probably I misheard, so I went on to do thing as usual. Around 5 minutes later the banging happened again. So I went to the door and see again, and again there was nobody there. This time I stationed myself at the security eye to see who is messing with us. Then suddenly the banging is there again. I quickly opened the door and there was no one. At that moment I was pretty scared. I had to let the light on for the whole night. On the next day when we checked out, the tour guy asked who stayed in that room, and he told us that room has a history. The hotel had a fire accident long ago, and that room has casualty during the accident. So I realized that the balcony is black because it was charred by fire. That the banging noise is most likely from the victim who did not escape on time or trapped inside. So after this incident, I believe that STH else exist in the world other than us. I've always believed in ghosts, but I had this certain ghost in my house that I used to be terrified of until I became friends with her. I named her Elizabeth. When I was 5 to 6 I moved into a new house that's a bungalow. I still live here, and I would hear constant knocking on my radiator. Everyone said that it was because of the tap because the bath and kitchen are next to my room. Even when the tap wasn't on I would hear a knocking sound on it. When I asked it to stop it would. I eventually named it and made up this story how she was a part of a family who used to live here in Victorian times. I haven't heard her in years, kinda miss her now. I have another story when I was visiting my nan in America. I was sleeping in my room I was sharing with my cousin. She lived by a forest, even deers would come through the garden, and I was almost asleep when I heard some man exhale right in my ear. I jolted up to see no one there and my cousin was fast asleep. I did not sleep that night. A few months ago I was joking around with my friends and playing with incense sticks I wasted to scare them, so I decided to say if Teresa ghost make this go straight on 3, then I counted to 3 and boom it went straight. Then there was a bang from outside the room and it was just me and my friends there, so then I got like hella scared but didn't say anything. A few days later I decided to go out and buy a reader and ask the ghost some questions thinking this isn't real, but like yeah. That's my story. My friends and I were staying at an Airbnb cabin near the base of some mountains in Colorado. Everyone had some kind of unexplainable experience that night. 2 that were sleeping downstairs constantly heard footsteps and doors opening and closing shut. They assumed it was the 2 of us upstairs, but we remained in our beds the whole night. My friend I was sharing a room with said he felt like someone was sitting at the foot of his bed and assumed it was me, but I was in my bed the whole night not being able to sleep because I was shivering despite it being the middle of July. I thought something was wrong with the AC. The next morning we got up and started talking. The 2 downstairs wanted to know what we were doing upstairs all night and opening doors. We told them we were in bed the whole night. My friend sharing a room with me asked me what I was doing sitting on his bed last night and I said I was in mine the whole time. We got around to the idea that there was a ghost in the cabin. One of us went outside to get something from the car and when she came back she said there was a dying bird on our driveway. I think I then said something along the lines of, yeah, this place is haunted, that bird is a test, don't touch it. We then looked through the guest book to see if anyone else had similar experiences. Nothing out of the ordinary, but we did find that the earlier entries were addressed to a Catherine and Randy, but later entries were addressed to Catherine only, the owner of the cabin. We all then decided that the ghost was named Randy. The bird was able to hobble into the front yard and die there, so I built a little cairn for it hoping to appease Randy in some way. That night we were playing a board game and Randy decides to start opening and slamming doors, particularly the one to the bedroom I was staying in. I slept on the couch that night. We finished out our trip, but we still talk about Randy from time to time.